In the year 2054, higher education had become a labyrinthine institution, a place where the noble pursuit of knowledge was overshadowed by a system rife with corruption, manipulation, and despair. College campuses, once bustling with eager minds and hopeful futures, had transformed into dystopian landscapes, where the pursuit of a degree was a nightmarish ordeal, fraught with insurmountable obstacles and soul-crushing experiences. For many students, the journey began long before they set foot on campus. The grueling process of standardized testing had become an insidious barrier, a cruel gatekeeper that determined one's fate. These tests, ostensibly designed to measure academic aptitude, had devolved into instruments of oppression. Scores were routinely inflated or deflated based on a student's socioeconomic status, race, or family connections. Legacy families, those whose ancestors had attended prestigious institutions for generations, wielded undue influence, ensuring their progeny sailed through the admissions process with ease. Meanwhile, students from marginalized communities faced systemic biases that all but guaranteed their failure. Alexandra Ruiz, a bright and determined young woman from a working-class neighborhood, was one such student. She had dreamt of becoming a doctor, driven by a desire to help those in her community who lacked access to adequate health care. Despite her exceptional grades and dedication, her standardized test scores were inexplicably low, a deliberate act of sabotage by the testing authorities who sought to maintain the status quo. Undeterred, Alexandra applied to every college she could, hoping that one would recognize her potential. When she finally received an acceptance letter, it was from a mid-tier university, known more for its exorbitant tuition fees than its academic rigor. Alexandra's relief was short-lived as she soon discovered the harsh realities of higher education in this new era. The curriculum was rigid and outdated, filled with mandatory courses that had little relevance to her chosen field. These classes were a money-making scheme, designed to prolong students' time in school and extract as much tuition as possible. Professors, once passionate educators, had become apathetic and indifferent. Many were adjuncts, overworked and underpaid, struggling to make ends meet. The few tenured professors left were more interested in their research grants and maintaining the institution's image than in teaching. Grades were no longer a reflection of a student's understanding or effort but were manipulated to fit the university's financial and political interests. High scores were reserved for those who could afford private tutors and donations to the institution, while others were systematically kept in a state of academic purgatory. As Alexandra navigated this treacherous landscape, she encountered other students whose dreams had been similarly shattered. There was Malik, a talented musician whose love for jazz was stifled by a mandatory accounting course that drained his creativity. Emma, a history buff, was forced to take computer science classes to meet arbitrary graduation requirements, her passion for the past eroded by the monotony of coding. Each student was a cog in a relentless machine, their individuality crushed under the weight of institutional greed and indifference. The psychological toll was immense. Mental health services were woefully inadequate, and the pressure to succeed in an unfair system led to a spike in anxiety, depression, and even suicides. The campus was a graveyard of broken spirits, with students walking like zombies, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The administration's response was to increase security measures and surveillance, treating symptoms rather than addressing the root causes of the malaise. As the years went by, The consequences of this dysfunctional system began to manifest in society at large. Graduates emerged from their academic ordeal burdened with crippling debt, their degrees often worthless in a job market that valued practical skills over theoretical knowledge. The once revered professions of medicine, law, and engineering were plagued by incompetence, as the educational institutions that produced these professionals had failed to provide them with a proper foundation. Society's trust in these pillars eroded, leading to widespread disillusionment and unrest. The cycle of despair continued, as each generation of students entered the system with diminishing hope, their dreams crushed by the same forces that had destroyed those who came before them. Alexandra, now a weary but determined advocate for educational reform, fought tirelessly to expose the corruption and advocate for change. But her efforts were met with resistance from powerful interests determined to maintain their grip on the lucrative higher education industry. In this bleak future, the promise of higher education had become a cruel illusion, a nightmare from which there was no escape. The legacy of inflated scores, manipulated admissions, and profit-driven curricula cast a long shadow, leaving a generation adrift, haunted by the ghosts of what could have been. As the years rolled on, the hope for a brighter future dimmed, leaving only a pervasive sense of dread and the chilling realization that the worst was yet to come. The years trudged on, and the grim realities of higher education continued to deepen. The once vaunted academic institutions had become nightmarish fortresses, where the pursuit of knowledge was secondary to the pursuit of profit. Alexandra's efforts, while noble, were akin to trying to douse a forest fire with a single bucket of water. The corruption was too entrenched, the interests too powerful, and the systemic decay too pervasive. Inside these institutions, the situation grew more dire with each passing semester. The relentless focus on profit led universities to embrace corporate partnerships with open arms. These partnerships came with strings attached, dictating the research topics, course content, and even the very ethos of the institutions. Academic freedom was a distant memory, replaced by the cold, calculating logic of the market. The campus of Alexandra's University, once a place of intellectual ferment, had morphed into a bleak, sterile environment. The classrooms were overcrowded, with students packed like sardines, fighting for a sliver of attention from their overburdened instructors. The libraries, once sanctuaries of learning, were now filled with outdated texts, their shelves collecting dust as funding for new acquisitions dried up. The buildings themselves, neglected and crumbling, stood as monuments to the decline of an entire system. Technology, initially heralded as the savior of education, had become another instrument of control. Online learning platforms were dominated by algorithms that prioritized profitability over pedagogy. These platforms tracked every keystroke, every click, analyzing students' behavior to determine the most efficient way to extract tuition fees and keep them enrolled for as long as possible. Personal data was harvested and sold to the highest bidder, privacy concerns brushed aside in the relentless quest for profit. The mental health crisis among students reached a fever pitch. Counseling services, underfunded and understaffed, were unable to cope with the deluge of distressed students. Appointments were scarce, and those lucky enough to secure one found themselves in rushed sessions with overworked therapists who could offer little more than platitudes. Suicide rates soared, a grim testament to the unbearable pressure and the lack of support. The administration's response was to install more security cameras and implement mandatory mental health workshops, superficial measures that did nothing to address the underlying issues. In this atmosphere of despair, Alexandra continued her advocacy, but the toll on her was immense. She watched as her peers succumbed to the relentless pressure, their dreams extinguished, their spirits broken. Malik, the once promising musician, dropped out, unable to bear the stifling environment any longer. He took a job as a barista, his saxophone gathering dust in a corner of his cramped apartment. Emma, the history enthusiast, graduated with a degree she despised, only to find herself in a low-paying job that barely allowed her to keep the lights on. As the system churned out graduates ill-prepared for the real world, the societal impact was devastating. The medical field, now populated by doctors whose education had been compromised by subpar training, saw an alarming rise in malpractice cases. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering from misdiagnoses and botched surgeries. Trust in the healthcare system plummeted, and those who could afford it sought treatment abroad, further exacerbating the divide between the rich and the poor. The legal profession fared no better. Courtrooms were filled with incompetent lawyers who had barely scraped through their flawed education. Justice became a commodity, accessible only to those with deep pockets, while the marginalized and disenfranchised were left to navigate a labyrinthine system on their own. The erosion of legal competence led to miscarriages of justice, fostering a sense of hopelessness and anger among the populace. Engineering and technological fields, once the backbone of innovation, stagnated. Bridges collapsed, buildings crumbled, and infrastructure projects failed spectacularly. The graduates tasked with these projects lacked the necessary skills and knowledge, having been fed a diet of rote learning and irrelevant coursework. The nation's infrastructure, once a source of pride, became a source of shame, a constant reminder of the decay that had taken root in the education system. In the political arena, the effects were equally catastrophic. Politicians, products of the same corrupted system, were ill-equipped to tackle the pressing issues of the day. Their policies were short-sighted, their decisions driven by self-interest and corporate influence. The public, disillusioned and distrustful, withdrew from the political process, leaving the field open for demagogues and opportunists who preyed on fear and division. As Alexandra looked out over this bleak landscape, she felt the weight of her own failures. Her tireless advocacy, her desperate attempts to expose the truth, had yielded little. The system was too vast, its roots too deep, its defenders too powerful. The dreams of her youth, the hope for a better future, had been ground to dust under the relentless march of an education system gone awry. And so, in this grim world, the promise of higher education remained a cruel illusion, a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The legacy of inflated scores, manipulated admissions, and profit-driven curricula cast a long shadow, leaving a generation adrift, haunted by the ghosts of what could have been. As the years rolled on, the hope for a brighter future dimmed, leaving only a pervasive sense of dread and the chilling realization that the worst was yet to come. In the end, Alexandra could only watch as the cycle of despair continued, each new generation entering the system with diminishing hope, their dreams crushed by the same forces that had destroyed those who came before them. The world had changed, and the once noble pursuit of knowledge had become a grotesque parody of itself, a place where ambition was stifled, creativity extinguished, and the human spirit broken. The future was bleak, and the nightmare showed no signs of ending. As the darkness of the education system's failures spread, the effects permeated every layer of society. By the late 2050s, the national morale had plummeted to unprecedented depths. News channels broadcast daily reports of infrastructure failures, medical mishaps, and legal injustices. The divide between the elite and the common citizen grew into an insurmountable chasm, fostering a society fractured along lines of wealth, access, and opportunity. In cities across the country, once vibrant and thriving communities fell into disrepair. Job markets shrank as employers lost faith in the qualifications of college graduates. The once booming tech industry, starved of innovation and crippled by a workforce unprepared for the challenges of the modern world, began to falter. Startups failed at alarming rates, unable to compete in a global market that still valued genuine expertise and practical knowledge. The repercussions of this decline rippled through the economy. Unemployment rates soared, and those fortunate enough to find work often faced precarious, low-paying jobs. The gig economy, initially seen as a stopgap, became the primary means of survival for many, trapping workers in cycles of instability and poverty. The middle class, the backbone of the nation's economic health, all but disappeared, leaving a stark division between the affluent and the destitute. Social unrest became a constant presence. Protests erupted regularly, sparked by the latest scandal or failure within the education system or another public institution. Students, burdened with insurmountable debt and facing bleak job prospects, took to the streets in waves of anger and desperation. The authorities responded with increasing force, turning campuses and city squares into battlegrounds. The once hallowed grounds of higher education were now scarred with the remnants of tear gas canisters and makeshift barricades. Alexandra, who had once been a beacon of hope for reform, now found herself a target. Her advocacy had exposed her to the ire of powerful figures within the educational and political systems. She received threats regularly, and her movements were closely monitored. Despite the personal risk, she continued her fight, but the toll on her was visible. Her once bright eyes were now weary, her voice hoarse from years of speaking out against an unyielding tide of corruption. The media, complicit in the perpetuation of the status quo, painted her as a radical, a troublemaker intent on destabilizing the nation. Yet, she persisted, driven by a sense of duty and the faint glimmer of hope that perhaps, against all odds, change was still possible. She spoke at underground gatherings, her words a mixture of fiery determination and somber realism, urging the few who still believed to continue the fight. Meanwhile, within the walls of the universities, the students faced a new kind of horror. The administrative bodies, in a desperate bid to retain control and profitability, resorted to even more draconian measures. Attendance was monitored with biometric scanners, and any sign of dissent was swiftly crushed. Surveillance drones patrolled campuses, their silent eyes ever watchful, creating an atmosphere of perpetual paranoia. Academic probation and expulsion rates soared as universities purged those they deemed troublemakers or underperformers. Curricula became even more convoluted and irrelevant. Classes were packed with busy work designed to keep students occupied and compliant rather than engaged and educated. Courses in critical thinking, ethics, and humanities were replaced with corporate-sponsored training programs that treated students like products on an assembly line, stripped of individuality and creativity. In this environment, the concept of academic achievement lost all meaning. Diplomas became little more than symbols of endurance rather than competence or knowledge. Employers, recognizing the worthlessness of these degrees, implemented their own rigorous screening processes, further disadvantaging those who had spent years and small fortunes pursuing higher education. The mental health crisis reached a breaking point. Clinics on campus were overwhelmed, and many students turned to self-medication to cope with the relentless pressure. Addiction rates soared, with students abusing prescription drugs, alcohol, and illicit substances. The consequences were devastating, as overdoses and substance-related deaths became common occurrences. Yet, the institutions turned a blind eye, focusing instead on maintaining their profit margins and public image. As the social fabric unraveled, the nation's political climate grew increasingly volatile. Demagogues exploited the chaos, promising simple solutions to complex problems. Authoritarian measures were implemented under the guise of restoring order, further eroding civil liberties and deepening societal divides. Public trust in institutions educational, legal, medical, and governmental was at an all-time low, replaced by a pervasive sense of fear and mistrust. Alexandra, now a shadow of her former self, witnessed the collapse with a heavy heart. Her life's work had been to champion education as a means of empowerment and societal betterment. But the reality she faced was a stark contrast, a twisted nightmare where education was a tool of oppression and despair. She continued to fight, but the forces against her were formidable, and the victories were few and far between. In the closing days of 2059, a particularly harsh winter descended upon the nation. The cold was a physical manifestation of the pervasive hopelessness that had gripped society. Alexandra, wrapped in a threadbare coat, stood before a small group of students in a dimly lit basement. Her voice, though tired, still carried the weight of conviction. "We cannot give up," she implored, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Even in the darkest times, we must find the strength to push back. Education should be our liberation, not our chains." The students, eyes wide with fear and determination, listened intently. They were the remnants of a generation beaten down by a corrupt system but not entirely broken. As Alexandra spoke, a flicker of hope ignited in their hearts, a small but vital spark. Outside, the wind howled through the desolate streets, carrying with it the whispers of a society on the brink. The future was uncertain, and the path to redemption fraught with peril. But as long as there were those willing to fight, there remained a glimmer of hope, however faint, that one day the nightmare might end, and the true promise of education could be reclaimed. The winter of 2059 turned into one of the harshest in recorded history, an unrelenting cold that seemed to mirror the pervasive chill of despair that gripped society. Snow piled high in the streets, turning cities into frigid wastelands. Power grids, already strained by years of neglect and mismanagement, began to fail. Rolling blackouts left millions shivering in the dark, their homes barely warmer than the icy outdoors. In this bleak landscape, Alexandra's resolve was tested daily. Her small group of followers, driven by desperation and the faintest glimmer of hope, continued to meet in secret, plotting ways to expose the corruption and bring about change. But their efforts were increasingly hampered by the ever-present surveillance and the threat of severe repercussions. The government, in a bid to maintain control amidst the chaos, declared a state of emergency. Martial law was imposed, and the streets were patrolled by heavily armed security forces. Any gatherings deemed subversive were broken up violently, and suspected dissidents were detained indefinitely. The promise of freedom and democracy was a distant memory, replaced by a suffocating authoritarian regime that ruled through fear and intimidation. Universities, once bastions of free thought and intellectual exploration, had become instruments of state propaganda. Courses in political theory and history were rewritten to reflect the government's narrative. Critical thinking was actively discouraged, replaced by rote memorization and blind obedience. Students were indoctrinated with a distorted version of reality, taught to see the government as their savior rather than their oppressor. Alexandra, now operating under a pseudonym, became a symbol of resistance. Her writings, smuggled out of meetings and disseminated through underground networks, spoke of truth, justice, and the power of collective action. Despite the constant danger, her words ignited a spark in the hearts of those who had all but given up. Small acts of defiance began to occur: graffiti denouncing the regime, secret meetings in basements and abandoned buildings, and whispers of a larger movement growing in the shadows. As the new decade approached, the societal decay continued to accelerate. The healthcare system, once a pillar of strength, had all but collapsed. Hospitals were overcrowded and understaffed, plagued by shortages of essential supplies and competent medical professionals. The wealthy sought treatment in private clinics or overseas, while the poor were left to fend for themselves in crumbling public facilities. Preventable deaths soared, and public health crises became the norm. The economy was in free fall. Hyperinflation rendered currency almost worthless, and essential goods became prohibitively expensive. Food shortages led to widespread hunger, with long lines forming outside government distribution centers. Crime rates skyrocketed as people turned to desperate measures to survive. The social contract, the unwritten agreement that held society together, was in tatters. In this environment, Alexandra's underground movement gained momentum. Despite the ever-present threat of discovery and the harsh winter conditions, more people joined the cause. They saw in her a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was a possibility for change. They organized covert operations, hacking into government networks to reveal the extent of the corruption and mismanagement, and staging protests that, though quickly quashed, spread the message of resistance. One fateful night, as a blizzard raged outside, Alexandra and her closest allies gathered in a decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They had received information about a significant leaked documents that could expose the full extent of the government's manipulation of the education system and its disastrous consequences. The risk was immense, but the potential reward was too great to ignore. As they worked through the night, hunched over outdated laptops and surrounded by the cold, they felt a sense of purpose that had long been absent. The documents were damning, detailing years of deceit, financial malfeasance, and deliberate attempts to stifle dissent. They knew that if they could get this information to the public, it might just be the catalyst needed to ignite a larger rebellion. But the government's surveillance network was ever vigilant. A sudden crash at the warehouse door shattered their concentration. Security forces, tipped off by informants or perhaps through advanced surveillance techniques, had found them. The ensuing chaos was brutal and swift. Alexandra and her comrades fought back, but they were no match for the heavily armed soldiers. Many were captured, others were killed. Alexandra herself was dragged away, bloodied but unbowed. As she was shoved into a transport vehicle, she locked eyes with one of her allies, a silent promise passing between them. The fight was far from over. Even as the vehicle sped away, the documents were already making their way through the underground network, passed from hand to hand, encrypted and hidden in the darkest corners of the digital world. The news of the raid spread quickly, a chilling reminder of the regime's reach and the high cost of resistance. But it also galvanized the movement. Alexandra's capture became a rallying cry, her writings and speeches circulating with renewed urgency. The government, in its attempt to crush dissent, had inadvertently made a martyr of her, strengthening the resolve of those who continued to fight. As the winter dragged on, the country teetered on the brink of collapse. The power outages became more frequent, the food shortages more severe. In the darkness and cold, people whispered of revolution, of a new dawn that might rise from the ashes of the old world. They clung to Alexandra's vision, her dream of an education system that empowered rather than enslaved, of a society built on justice and equality. But for now, the nightmare continued. The streets remained dangerous, the future uncertain. The struggle for a better world was long and arduous, filled with pain and sacrifice. Yet, in the hearts of those who believed, the spark of hope refused to die. It was a small, flickering flame, but in a world shrouded in darkness, it was enough to keep the dream alive. In the aftermath of Alexandra's capture, the country continued its descent into chaos. The harsh winter gave way to a brutal spring, and the cracks in society widened, exposing the depths of the systemic rot. Despite the government's efforts to suppress dissent, Alexandra's message continued to resonate, her writings and speeches echoing through the underground networks like a ghostly reminder of a better future. The documents she and her allies had risked everything to reveal began to surface, first in obscure forums and encrypted chat rooms, then in larger, more public venues. They painted a grim picture of the corruption and greed that had infiltrated every level of the education system and beyond. The public, already disillusioned and desperate, reacted with outrage. Protests erupted in cities and towns across the nation, drawing people from all walks of life. The government's response was predictably harsh, but the sheer scale of the unrest made it impossible to quell completely. In the prisons, Alexandra became a symbol of resilience. Despite the harsh conditions and constant surveillance, she continued to find ways to communicate with the outside world. Her spirit remained unbroken, and her resolve only strengthened. The guards, tasked with keeping her in check, could not help but be affected by her determination. Some even began to question their own roles in the oppressive system they served. As the movement grew, so did the government's desperation. They tightened their grip, enacting even more draconian measures in a futile attempt to maintain control. The economy continued to crumble, and with it, the thin veneer of legitimacy that the regime clung to. Rumors of defections within the military and security forces spread, hinting at a fracture within the very heart of the power structure. One fateful night, a coordinated effort by the underground resistance culminated in a daring raid on the prison where Alexandra was held. Utilizing information from sympathetic guards and exploiting weaknesses in the security protocols, they managed to free her and several other key figures. The escape was a beacon of hope, a dramatic reminder that the regime was not infallible. In the following months, Alexandra and the resistance orchestrated a series of strategic strikes against key government facilities, each one weakening the regime's hold on power. The public, emboldened by these successes, took to the streets in even greater numbers. The protests evolved into full-blown uprisings, with citizens reclaiming their cities and towns. The tipping point came when a massive blackout plunged the entire nation into darkness. In the cover of night, the resistance launched their most ambitious operation yet, a coordinated assault on the heart of the government. With the help of defectors from the military and security forces, they breached the fortified walls of the capital. As dawn broke, the once imposing government buildings lay in ruins, their symbols of oppression toppled. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the echoes of battle. Amidst the rubble, Alexandra stood, weary but unyielding, her presence a testament to the indomitable spirit of the resistance. The regime's leaders, realizing the futility of their position, surrendered. Their capitulation marked the end of an era of corruption and tyranny. In the days that followed, a provisional council, composed of resistance leaders and defectors, took control, promising to restore democracy and rebuild the shattered nation. The road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges. The scars of the past ran deep, and the task of rebuilding the education system and other public institutions required immense effort and unwavering dedication. Yet, there was a palpable sense of hope and determination in the air. The people, having witnessed the power of collective action, were ready to reclaim their future. Alexandra, hailed as a hero, continued to play a pivotal role in shaping the new order. She tirelessly advocated for an education system that prioritized critical thinking, creativity, and inclusivity. Her vision of a society where knowledge was a tool of empowerment rather than oppression began to take root. Under her guidance, universities were reformed, stripped of corporate influences, and rebuilt as centers of genuine learning and innovation. Admission processes were overhauled to ensure fairness and transparency, and curricula were redesigned to reflect the diverse needs and aspirations of the students. Mental health services were expanded, and a culture of support and collaboration replaced the toxic competition that had once defined academia. The economic and social reforms extended beyond education. Efforts were made to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, with policies aimed at redistributing wealth and providing opportunities for all. The healthcare system was revitalized, and the legal system restructured to ensure justice for everyone, regardless of their background. As the nation slowly healed, the spirit of the resistance endured, serving as a reminder of the power of unity and the importance of standing up against tyranny. Alexandra, though haunted by the memories of the dark days, found solace in the progress they had made and the lives they had touched. In the end, the nightmare that had once gripped the nation was transformed into a story of resilience and redemption. The future, once shrouded in darkness, now held the promise of a brighter, more equitable world. The The fight had been long and arduous, but the victory was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the unyielding belief in the possibility of change.